warm greetings to everyone present here for this panel discussion. I, Anam Qazi, a student of Master's ELT, Aligarh Muslim University, feel obliged to welcome our respected speakers, moderator and attendees to the conclusive panel of Raleigh Literary Festival 2023, titled Science Fiction Writing in. So far, it has been a riveting discussion from the realms of digital humanities, graphic novels, cinema, with great speakers bringing together the paradigms of literature, existing and persevering in all walks of human life. Keeping up with that same enthusiasm and love for literature, we will begin our panel following the theme of writing science fiction in India, its birth and evolution, its ever-changing chapters and fate in the dynamic Indian literature. The Raleigh Literary Society had the honor of inviting the pioneering and central figures of Indian science fiction literature. We have with us Dr. Sami Ahmad Khan and Mr. Samit Basu. Dr. Sami Ahmad Khan is a fellow at the University of Oslo, Norway, where he runs the EU-funded project, The New Monsters Within the Others in India's Science Fiction. A writer, academic, and documentary producer, Sami Ahmad Khan delves in the Indian science fiction as his genre of interest. His assortment of creative and academic writings have been published in acclaimed journals, university presses, and trade imprints, including but not limited to Bloomsbury, Routledge, and Juggernaut. His critically acclaimed novels, Red Jihad, Battle for South Asia, and Aliens in Delhi, both futuristic war thrillers, are gems of Indian science fiction. Mr. Samit Basu is an Indian fantasy and science fiction writer who wears many hats. He is a novelist, a film director, a screenwriter. His first book, The Simokine Prophecies, published in 2003, was the first book in his best-selling Game World trilogy. His most recent work, The City Inside, was on the lists for the Washington Post's and Book Riot SFF books of 2022. His debut film, House Arrest, which he wrote and co-directed, was released as part of Netflix's International Originals in 2019. His diverse area of work spans to comics, including collaborations with ex-writers M.R. Carey and Grant Morrison. Our moderator for the session is Mr. Kaif Siddiqui. He is currently a PhD student at the Nalsar University of Law in Hyderabad. He is particularly interested in cultural legal studies and the connections between law, technology, and science fiction. His essays have appeared in The Hindu, The Indian Express, and The Print. Having said all that, this is safe to say this session is going to be an absolute treat for lovers of fantasy and science fiction. Without further ado, I invite our distinguished panelists and session moderator. Over to you, Mr. Siddiqui.
So good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all here. So let's start with trying to unpack the very term science fiction. And I believe both Mr. Samit and Dr. Khan would have a lot to say about this. So science fiction obviously is not easy to define. It seemingly has no starting point. Some people will say it started here. Some people will say it started here. Some people, like, if you talk about Western sci-fi, people will talk about Asimov and Clarke. Some people will go further back and say it started with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. And across cultures, across different time periods, it has associated with so many things. And in the Indian context specifically, as Dr. Khan has written about this in his book, Star Warriors of the Modern Raj, he has talked about it in detail, like how many things you can associate with Indian science fiction specifically, and the idea of the mythic that is unique to India. So Dr. Khan, I'll start with you. Can you take us through this specific, what all that is included in this term science fiction? Over to you.
Hi, it's so good to be here, and it's good to see you, Kaif. Good to see you, Samit, again. And so before I start talking about science fiction, I would say that if we try to understand 21st century Indian SF, I think a good place to start for SFF, and not just SF, would be Samit Basu. And I say this not because he's here, but because when I first read Samit almost two decades ago, I didn't know that this could be done in the Indian context. And he did it. And he did it so well that he was kind of a pioneering figure in ways more than one, that his reading made fans like me realize, what, this could be done in the Indian context, and this is so cool. And there's you can actually do it. It's not something you associate with American or Anglo-American productions or French productions. This is something that you could do, and there's such a treasure trove of of information. And that is why I tried to understand how science fiction itself, what it was and what it worked. And I've written, well, to be honest, I've written extensively about it. I've written about it so much time. So done with this entire idea of science and fiction and science fiction and India and Anglophone, because, well, after a monograph and after 5 or 10 articles, you're like, no, I cannot write on this anymore. I just need to think about something else, right? But at the same time, we need to identify what science is. Now, the definition of science keeps on changing. We need to identify what fiction is. What constitutes fiction for one people may not be fiction for another. And you very rightly pointed out that what is, who is the patient zero of science fiction? Who's the, what is the urtext? Where did it begin? And this is how I kind of also began my, my PhD, because this is the first questions that I had to answer was that, when the science fiction actually began. And I was talking to people, and some of them said, what, Brahmastra were nuclear weapons, so therefore we had science, and therefore, since we had science 5,000 years ago, therefore we had science fiction. And I was like, oh, okay. Some people said, what, that is so not true. We do not have a SF tradition at all. Whatever happens is happening in the 21st century. We don't have that at all, right? And I'm like, okay, hang on. So I kind of tried to find a middle ground. And even a very cursory, historical analysis would lead to the fact that there have been multiple SF texts in India, from India, written by Indians in the 19th century itself. So SF is not something that is a recent implant, that has, that's a recent import. SF has had a history in India, perhaps at the same time that SF was coming of age in the West. And, examples from, Bangla would be Ray, Bose, they were writing, not Satyajit Ray, I think Jagdandhar Ray. He was writing in the late 19th century at the same time when H.G. Wells and Jules Verne was, right? So we have had a very robust tradition of science fiction, but that has been in languages which unfortunately I cannot read. Though yes, there were some Hindi texts too, but it was primarily in Bangla. There was some text in English too, 1905, Ruqya Sakhavat Hussain, Sultana's Dream. Then the two Dutt brothers wrote something which was published in, I think, 1835 and 1845, 2 short stories, novellas, The Republic of Orissa and A Day in the Year from 1945, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. So this is 1835 and 45. 1905 is Ruqya Sakhavat Hussain, Sultana's Dream in English itself, right? But then in the 20th century, we perhaps don't have that kind of, quantitative SF production in Indian English. And this is the disclaimer I have to make right away, is because I work on Indian Anglophone SF, so that is my vantage point, and that is what I'm going to talk about. I can't talk about SF, wonderful SF that has been written in the 20th century itself, in say Marathi by Narlikar, or in Tamil by Sujata, or in Assamese by D.C. Goswami. So I can't really talk about that. I can just talk about English. And yes, so I guess this is my point, that this point of origin keeps on shifting. And after so I have dedicated, I think, the past 10 years to this question, and now I can honestly say that it doesn't really matter. What really matters is that you're getting to read and consume good SF today, and that is what where I'll end this.
Samit, would you like to add to this?
No,
You can.
not at all. I know he said many wise and clever things, and he also said nice things about me, which is very kind of him, and only because I'm here, right? But Dr. Khan, or Sami, as I've known him for some time, is a very kind person and also very scholarly and well-read one. So everything he said was more than I know. I usually try to avoid defining science fiction. I realized what I thought was India is not India, apparently. Um, so I don't care at a very fundamental level because, first of all, I'm not going to read all these ancient texts, right? So, um, as Dr. Khan said, also I fundamentally do not care where it started. Because so for me, the definition of science fiction is whatever a writer or a reader feels like. You know it when you know it when you see it way, because that's because we seem to be in a world where everything just runs on vibes. So that's where I am.
So, Dr. Khan, when he was talking about reading your work, he said that he realized that you can do this, and it was something new for him. So, as a writer for you, Samit, was there a point where you realized you had these ideas, you had this, you could do this as a writer? What was it like for you?
See, I mean, the thing about, I mean, again, it was very kind of you, but the thing is that I didn't know that I was writing genre, right? Because I'm quite ancient. So when I was growing up in a pre-internet world, um, I knew that fantasy and science fiction were things, but I thought that they were descriptors of a book. I didn't know there were entire boxes into which you can only belong into this box, and if you belong in this box, you can't belong to the other box, and so on. Because our bookstores weren't designed like that. There would just be a sprawl of books and one ancient man, usually with few teeth missing, who would look at you and know what book you needed in your life. And that's how I discovered a lot of books, apart from recommendations from family and friends. And that's how I found science fiction as well, apart from the school library. So I knew that, say, Asimov or whoever, Asimov and Douglas Adams, etc., were science fiction, but I thought that it was a descriptor. I didn't know what genre was. So I found that I was so when I wrote my first novel, for example, I knew that it was fantasy. That was one of the descriptors you could apply to it. Um, that it to many people disqualified it from being literature was something I was not aware of until it was published. That it was supposed to be special in any way because it was fantasy was also something that I didn't care about at all. But it was like, oh, someone in fantasy, excellent. As long as you're buying the book, I'm very happy. What irked me though was that people were calling it science fiction. People were calling it science fiction in the newspapers, and it was not science fiction. Like, even I knew that there was no space in it, there was no robots in it, whatever. Like, everything I associated with science fiction was not in the book, and yet, like, happily, it's like, oh, this science fiction. I have not. So I really started writing science fiction only so that public descriptions of me would not be a lie. You know. So in retrospect, I was not faking it, and and that was 20 years ago. Yeah.
So, do you think things have changed in the past 20 years, like how people perceive the genre and everything that is within it? How people understand, let's say, the differences between speculative fiction and science fiction? Do you think there's been a shift?
See, I think there have been some important shifts. Some important shifts in the sense that many, many, many more books in these spaces have been published and read by audiences, even though there hasn't been much mainstream appreciation or kind of celebration of these books. But that is really more a function of mainstream attention towards books in general being decimated than any kind of specific genre snobbery in India, because we don't have genres, though we don't even have books coverage. What has also been very interesting is that there has been a lot of work outside publishing, sort of work like Dr. Khan is doing and various others, important scholarly work. There's people trying to make sci-fi fantasy in different media. So, so the short answer, everything has changed in the last 20 years, right? But the way that you see that impact at a mainstream public level, probably nothing has changed. In fact, it's probably gotten worse. But is that because publishing in general has gotten worse, or the world has gotten worse, both of which are true? Or is it something genre specific? Is something I don't know. But what I do know is that even if there was like 15 times the amount of work that there is, and there is an exponentially growing amount of work, I don't think we're culturally in a time where people are really looking at this from the mainstream. And this is part of, people are not looking at any kind of non-functional culture or non kind of this is the real meaning of things culture in India, right? So yeah, so, genre kind of flying under the radar is a part of that.
And how do you think the the other medium that have emerged over the past, let's say, 10 years, how have they contributed to understanding science fiction in general?
Not
Like,
at all. They have not contributed at all. They are just, I mean, they are trying in their own way to inefficiently and incompletely replicate the wonderful work that is being done in text. But I think while I had fun saying that, I think Dr. Khan will be able to provide both a more cogent and possibly a more correct answer. So Sami, don't just sit and smile at us benignly while I talk. Tell us, teach us.
Come on, Samit. This just sounds so wrong coming from you. Okay, because well, I kind of agree with Samit, but if you talk about the context of Indian Anglophone science fiction, that as you know he was also talking about, that a lot has changed in the past 20 years. That a lot of writers are doing excellent work in SF, and I'm not talking about SFF. I'm not talking about, and I think that this is something that we should talk about, because you said that what is speculative fiction, what is FFF, what is SF, what is the relationship between these three things. So just to put it very, very bluntly and very simply for the benefit of maybe the BA students who are here, if I may, with your permission, Kev. So I mean, when you talk about science fiction, when you talk about fantasy, and when you talk about the mythic, for example, or say mythology, all these three can be seen as speculative fiction because, well, they are non-mimetic genres. They are non-mimetic ways of storytelling. They are telling something that may not exactly exist in the world, or it may not correspond to something that exists exactly in the world. So that's why you have to imagine, right? But what is the basic difference between these three? Again, this is a bone of contention, and almost every single SF writer or critic you will talk will have a different definition of this. This is mine. This is not essentially the correct definition, but this is the way I approach it. So feel free to tell me that this doesn't work for you.
This doesn't work for me. No, go on.
Okay. Okay. No. Okay.
I'm reminded
of
Dr. Khan. I'm reminded of that example that you've given in your book, where you talk about how in fantasy, if a person is teleporting from point A to point B, so
Exactly.
in fantasy that will be achieved through magic, and in science fiction that will be achieved through some advanced technology. That is, I think, a great way to understand the difference.
Exactly.
No, but please go on. I was just disagreeing on principle with the correct thing you're going to say.
That's the way it should be. But right now, I'm equally happy and horrified that Kaif has somehow read parts of the book. Okay, so that being said, I mean, this is an example which I very often use because it's somebody, it's something which almost everybody understands at the class 12th level or the class 10th level. So it doesn't really, okay. So suppose, an object moves from point A to point B, within the blink of an eye, like this. Suppose you see a glass here, you see a hand here, and then you close your eyes, and then suddenly the hand is here. So if I were to ask you what just happened, you would say, well, this is displacement of matter. This is, instantaneous displacement of matter. So somebody who's writing science fiction might say, okay, I'm going to explain this using teleportation, using, quantum entanglement, something like, Star Trek, the transporter of Star Trek. Somebody who wants to write fantasy or is writing fantasy might say, well, this is because of magic, and this is because, some magical force. Think Harry Potter, think apparition, think Dumbledore, right? It's the same thing happening, but the way it's described is different. If somebody is writing, mythology, they might say something, well, this happens because of the will of a divine being. This happens because, well, the Bifrost Bridge made it so, and, well, the Bifrost Bridge is made by the gods, right? So, yeah, so, I mean, this is just one way of approaching it. But then, as Samit very rightly pointed out, is that initially when I heard that a lot of people who were writing science fiction, when approached and asked, hey, do you write science fiction? Their first response was, you know what, not exactly. And when I first asked these questions to writers almost a decade ago, when I was doing my PhD, the fan in me, the SF fan in me was like really hurt. It's like, okay, I have been SF fan all my life, and you are writing SF. You're writing about, say, starships in space. And when I asked you, is this SF? You were like, not exactly. Initially, I was extremely hurt. But then I realized the wisdom behind those words, because people were not writing good SF. They were writing good stories. And if I were to sort of reduce their work to just one genre, then perhaps that would be mean to them, because they were not talking about a particular genre at all. They were there to tell good stories. It's us, who are classifying and categorizing, these stories as science fiction, fantasy. Somebody working in academics or somebody working in the publishing industry is very, keen to jump the gun and, sort of take these labels and say, well, you don't know what you're doing. Let us tell you what you're exactly doing. And it's offensive. It's offensive to those who are writing, because they are not exactly doing that all the time, right? So for example, I very categorically write science fiction. I'm like, okay, I love this genre. I love the genre so much that I want to write SF. I'm not going to write SFF because, well, I want to write SF more, right? And SFF is science fiction and fantasy, in which, you have elements of both SF and fantasy. So I hope that this can be a very basic and rough tool set to sort of, think with. Of course, like just puncture it, destroy it to bits, whatever you feel like doing. But for me, this works as a starting point.
Okay, so one of the most fascinating things that I personally I find fascinating about science fiction is, which is also something that you mentioned in your book. I have to bring it up again. So you mentioned that there's a distinction between past, present, and future that we make, and science fiction can help us challenge that very distinction. And you give the example of the Kaurava Empire, this book where there is an intergalactic civilization in the ancient Indian city of Hastinapur. So that immediately like sets our imaginations running, and we just that. So can you tell us something more, a little bit more about this breakdown in our concepts of time and space that sci-fi can, and especially in the Indian context?
Sure. See, a lot of science fiction depends on a particular kind of temporality, especially the kind of science fiction that used to come from the West. Used to. In that it was influenced heavily by Abrahamic eschatology and the perception of time, that you have a past, present, and future. It's a linear flow of time from the past to the present to the future. However, when you come to India, where you have a different kind of mythic, where you have a different kind of storytelling tradition, in which this linear movement from the past, present, and future isn't really linear. It's cyclical, it's helical, it's, call it whatever you want. It's the idea of yug, right? That a yug will start, and a yug will then end, and another yug, and then Mahayug. So, you have this sort of a different conception of time. So what is essentially past? Maybe the future for some other civilization. And so this is what I basically talked about. And this is not something which is, this is used by Indian writers, of course, but this is not something which I call as solely Indian, because if you remember at the ending of Battlestar Galactica, BSG, if you've seen BSG, the TV series 2003-4. So BSG ends with this, that these guys finally find an Earth, which is our Earth, and they arrive, I think, 50,000 years before or something like that, right? So yeah, exactly. So as I'm sorry, I wasn't reading the comments, so I just did, but I'll get to them. I was just talking to, yeah. So this entire idea of how time operates, right? There's also one more way. So you can have the idea of linear time, right? You can have the idea of cyclical or helical time, right? Because the data points change. So it's not exactly cyclical, but helical, because space-time changes, right? There's one more idea of time, that is the quantum idea of time, in which you have everything happening everywhere all at once. So it basically depends on you as a storyteller of what kind of temporality suits your narrative to tell the story that you're trying to tell, right? And again, as I said, Indian SF writers do this brilliantly, and it's so much fun to read because the present becomes the past and the future. And so think of the speciality of a narrative and the temporality of it. And once you have these pointers set, then maybe again, it may help us understand the world that is being created. I hope that makes any sense to you. I'm just
It does. It does.
yeah.
So in the comments, we have a lot of comments. We can look at them as well as we continue our discussion. So, Dr. Khan, if you would like to respond to some of the comments.
Yeah. Uh, about the SF being so, I mean, sci-fi, SF, call it whatever you want. I mean, that's the point. It's not something that is set in stone. SF is a genre. Genre keeps on changing, right? You can approach them in any way you want. Initially, yes. So this is something, a lot of points that I'm making sometimes may run counter to what I wrote in the monograph. And the reason is that you need to first establish something in order to destroy it. So I was trying to not establish it, in a critical way that, okay, this is how it appears to be. And then you can implode it. You can't just implode something ex nihilo. You first have to set the boundaries. So that is why I tried to set the boundaries of Indian Anglophone SF in that. And now I'm like, okay, you know what? Maybe we don't really need these terms at all, because these terms are limiting at the same time. So yes, call it SF, call it sci-fi, call it whatever you want, call it whatever works for you. There is no one person telling you what SF is or should be or has to be. I mean, nobody would say that to you. So you have to find your own way of telling a story. So if something else works for you, go ahead, call it something else, right?
The thing is that if we get caught up in these labels, we forget that
Exactly.
at its core,
Exactly.
we just want good stories. We just want to write good stories. We want to read good stories, and at
Exactly.
that point, these labels don't matter really.
Exactly.
You drive away people. People run away with a haunted look in their eye. But the thing is that I agree with everything you said, Sami, but there's also that thing where I think that these terms are very useful when people are coming to them with a certain amount of affection or with a certain amount of enthusiasm. Because there's really, I mean, there's a lovely thing that happens where people are enthusiastic about work because it's science fiction. Or people are enthusiastic about work because it's fantasy or any of these other genres, right? So whenever these terms are used in an inclusive way, then that's just a lovely thing that really brings people together and creates a community, which is very great. It's when they're used in an exclusive way, either in in an exclusionary way, I should say, either in a professional context in publishing, or even I don't read that kind of book, whatever that kind of book is. That's when you get toxicity in genre, which exists across genres. Like it exists in litfic, exists in romance, exists SF, fantasy, all of that. So it's an interesting thing watching the balance of these two sides, these two approaches to genre in individual readers or individual writers. So for example, I mean, you were I think you judged yourself very harshly, Sami, when you thought you had offended that writer, where you had gone and said, is this science fiction? They were like, no, it's not, and drew themselves up sharply. That writer was very shady. They were trying to say science fiction is beneath me. Now that's just stupid, right? It's I mean, which immediately means that the work itself loses value, and you lose no value for liking it for its speculative aspects. But as a writer, when that writer made you feel like you diminished the work, or your analysis or your feelings about it were inferior in any way because they approached the speculative or imaginative aspects of the work, not a good writer and shady person. So I think in a lot of these things, what matters is the intent you bring into it, is the feelings you bring into it. Because these terms are useful because they're quick and easy way of describing vast bodies of work which simply aren't similar to the work that a lot of people are familiar with, especially if they're Indian, especially if they're coming out of literary traditions or any kind of art traditions that have nothing to do with, say, I don't know, when something goes mainstream like Game of Thrones or the Marvel Universe or Star Wars or something like that, then suddenly people forget that they don't like science fiction or fantasy, and they buy the t-shirts, right? So it's always fluid. But if you're approaching it from an inclusive point of view, and you're approaching it with affection and love and enthusiasm, then I think these are fantastic and relevant terms and always will be.
So you mentioned the word mainstreaming. So I think it's a interesting thing to think about whether or not we, as lovers of science fiction, do we want science fiction to become mainstream in India? Because once something does go mainstream, you have, all the corporate interests, and storytelling goes down. You know, as companies chase the next big thing, storytelling is lost. So, and we are seeing this now. Because of the Marvel universe, obviously Bollywood is building its own universes, and I doubt the level of artistic intentions in there. How much of it is business? How much of it is actual art? So, what is your take on this? Like, is there a possibility for science fiction to become mainstream in India? And if it does, would that be a good thing?
Well, I think it's already mainstream, first of all. And I mean, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is completely dependent on the viewer. Like the moment you're screening, I don't know, Star Wars or Marvel or whatever in Hindi or in any non-English Indian language, it is a part of the cultural mainstream. Those movies make a hell of a lot of money in this country, by the way, right? The moment you're playing any big video game, you are participating in mainstream genre consumption, and you're doing this in India. And when you are doing this, you're not measuring this work for its Indianness. You're engaging it with it as a reader or a viewer or a player or whatever it is. Um, the moment that while those of us who are writing this or studying it or engaging with these fields in any way, we are basically engaging with it via multinational corporations or big film studios. It's not exactly super niche work. It's already very much in the cultural mainstream. Now we complain because they don't pay us as much money as they pay Chetan or whoever, right? But that doesn't make it the margins, right? Um, the fact that I've been able to kind of make a living writing across media for the last 20 years, and pretty much all of it in fantasy and science fiction, means that it's not, I mean, there's nothing about the genre that is outside. I think ever since the 70s with Star Wars, since then science fiction and fantasy have been mainstream. If it wasn't then I think in 2002 or whatever it was that the Lord of the Rings movies came out and the Harry Potter books came out and all of that, it's not a thing anymore. The kind of backlash of litfic or whatever is no longer relevant, though it's still discussed, but largely because people are fairly insular in their consumption and haven't realized that the world has moved on. So and the interesting question, though, as far as cross genre science fiction fantasy engagement is concerned, is, so if you're looking at it from a point of view of Indian creators and so um on what terms do they engage with the global industry? On what terms do they engage with the national mainstream? Right? Um, if a lot of and also a lot of the work that is made with the intent to be science fiction or fantasy and released into the wild and seen by crores of people, that you would consider trash creatively, and justifiably so, and I would probably agree with you, um, appeals to a lot of people whose tastes and preferences just are different from yours, worse than yours, different from yours, um, and who don't care what genre it is, but it qualifies as fantasy, SF, whatever.
But then there's an issue there. Like, obviously, the elephant in the room is AI now, and so the overall standard, you can say, still is going down, is likely to go down. Especially, you see, the
No,
writers are
no,
striking in America.
no, the writers should strike in America, but I'm saying the standard, the inequality in of course, AI will make everything worse, but things are already really bad, you know. So, but I mean, AI is a problem on an economic front, because people who don't understand the difference between good material and bad material will simply, you know, fire a lot of human writers and get free text. They can't tell whether it's good or bad, right? It's cheaper, but that's great. So that's obviously bad, but that's not going to make the work you see worse, because you're only going to be seeing the best things. You're going to not be seeing the spam. You already don't see the spam. There is a lot of spam.
So I want to talk about your book as well, The City Inside. So
All right.
you mentioned in an interview that you deliberately chose to focus on the internal aspect of the story rather than heroes fighting a revolution or something. And like, well, can tell us more about that specific aspect of your characters.
Which specific aspect of my characters?
You mentioned in an interview that you chose to go for a narrative that was more focused on the internal lives of the
Yeah.
characters and how they interact with each other instead of the traditional, what one would imagine, the more common thing that they are going fighting in revolution and changing the world.
Yeah.
So that is a specific creative choice. So please tell us more about that.
No, because I was trying to draw this book from reality. I was trying to draw this book from present day India to a projected future 10 years or so in the past. And because I was drawing it from reality, and because I'm from this part of the world, and while in the West people can look at horrible conditions that exist in real world places and say, oh, this is dystopia. Here you just live in it, right? You live in it, so you're well aware that there is no, like, it's the fixing of a horrible political situation or the fixing of a horrible cultural situation is not a matter of somebody decided to make a difference. There are already people who have all the correct revolutionary ideas. There are already people who understand the processes through which they might make a place or a time better. It's just that they're caught in this horrible cycle where I just did not find that it was feasible in a world drawn from reality that suddenly everything could be fixed in this part of the world over the next 10 years by some kind of revolution, right? So I was more concerned with how do people who have a certain amount of privilege, who are not thrust into conflict by absolute desperation or necessity, how do people who have the option to look away from the state of things in our part of the world, how do they find a way to stay people, to survive the times we live in, and to evolve in some way, contribute to the betterment of themselves as people and the world around them? Because I did not find it feasible that they could fix anything. So it was really that.
And then on a similar vein, Dr. Khan, your two books deal with sci-fi in the context of India-Pakistan relations. And that really, like, I never thought, because obviously our mind is so conditioned by Western sci-fi that we only imagine things in the Western side of the world. And we don't think that there are so many of these, some things that are specific to our life as Indians, and some things are there in our consciousness all our lives. And the fact that you chose to write two books on that are themed around the relationship between India and Pakistan, which has cultural aspects, which has geopolitical aspects, which has social and historical aspects. It is significant in so many ways. So what was the process like? How was how did you go about doing your research for this? Because obviously on an issue like this you could spend years doing your research. So how was it like setting a sci-fi narrative around this specific aspect?
Aligarh. See, I was just having fun. As simple as that. I was just having fun, and Google Baba is our best friend when it comes to researching about writing military thrillers, because I was trying to fuse military thriller as a genre with science fiction, and it needed access to certain kinds of information that wasn't available readily. So, but then if you go to Google and if you dig hard enough, you will find anything and everything. As for the mechanics of doing it, as I said, that I wasn't writing for anybody else other than me, to be honest, because I was just having fun with something that, I wanted to see aliens in Delhi. I wanted to see all these things, so I just thought, well, you know what, let me construct a narrative about it. As for how and why, so something that truly fascinates me is that you take a genre, you take its mechanics, you take its semantic elements, what constitutes the genre. You take its syntax, how those elements are placed in the story, and then you have a rough idea of how things operate. Okay, yeah. So what I'm really interested in and what really makes me happy is that you have this structure, this seemingly stable structure of a genre in front of you. You take one particular fiber of it, You destabilize that microstructure, and then you see how the entire system unfolds on itself. So that is why with Red Jihad, it was about how you take a military thriller and a political thriller, how you take it, how you fuse it, and how you very gently deconstruct it through the narrative. And as I said, I was just having fun. I wasn't writing for any other reason other than that. I mean, I was in my MPhil and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to write a thesis. I'm going to write a novel instead. And then I'm just going to shift to a PhD. So I mean, I can't do MPhil. I can't write my MPhil, MPhil thesis. But and then for Aliens in Delhi, something similar happened. Was that I was just sitting outside my hostel. So the first draft of Aliens in Delhi was written in, I think, October, November, December 2012. That is when the first draft was written. I was just sitting outside my hostel, having a cup of tea. This is JNU Brahmaputra Hostel, surrounded by greenery, and Neil guys. So it was a nice place to sit and think. And I saw a lot of these, these telecommunication towers coming out, because at that time, mobile networks were a problem, and so therefore a lot of these towers were being installed everywhere. And that made me think not just of the technological ramifications, but the social ramifications of what would follow, what would very soon follow. This is India 2012. We are just at the cusp. And I was like, okay, well, this tower is there, of course, EM radiation, but what else? How is that EM radiation actually going to affect the fabric of the society? When it comes to us as WhatsApp messages, when it comes to us as free data, when it comes to us, as different kind of histories. And I was like, you know what? Maybe this could be a nice alien weapon of transmuting or human beings into something else, and into this human alien hybrid that loses its consciousness. And I did that while using the entire structure of a military thriller fused with science fiction, and then you just destabilize one thing, and then you just have fun. And as I said, I honestly wasn't writing for the market, because I just like to have fun. And if it goes in the market, well, good for it. If it doesn't go in the market, no problem. However, things have changed now, because you grow as a human being, and then you realize that, okay, if bad things are happening, if messed up things are happening, maybe the least you can do is write about them. Nobody may read it. Nobody has to read it. But at least you will feel that, okay, well, I felt this was wrong, and I wrote a story about it, or I wrote a novel about it. So that is why, and here I'll give the example of 15004 and Biryani Bagh. 2 short stories that were published in the 2 Golans volumes. And that is when I decided that, okay, now I'm going to deal actively with otherization. Till then, so I'm a huge fan of pulp. I'm a huge fan of pulp. I love pulp. That's the reason why I came into SF and SF research in the first place, because I was fascinated by pulp. And now I think that you take pulp, you take certain conventions of the pulp, and you make them have people ask questions. And well, as I said, that things are changing. And at this point, honestly, I don't know why I'm writing, because earlier in college, I used to write to have fun. Now it's difficult having fun in a world that is so broken. It was broken 10 years ago too, 15 years ago too. But now the fractures are much more visible. And at this point, I'm just asking myself of what I'm doing. So I have no answers, as of now.
So that's something actually that resonates deeply with me. The very idea of finding that fiber, taking apart, and I think that is the science fiction actually provides the closest thing to doing actual science with words and ideas, because you literally can do anything you like. You pick apart and put things together in whatever form you want. It may become a monstrosity, and even that monstrosity could be beautiful, right? So, Samit, could you tell us something about your creative process while working on your books?
I don't think about it as much as Sami clearly does. No, I mean, I don't know how to talk about it. I've been doing this for about 20 years. I think I'm the next science fiction fantasy novel that comes out in October will be, I don't know, my 8th, 9th, something. Then the children's books, there are lots of movies, screenplays, most of which didn't get made. Comics, this, that. So it's obviously always, I mean, the question of why am I doing any of this is the only answer I've always been confident about is that I actually like it. Um, I actually like the act of it. I don't particularly care. I mean, first of all, no one knows what the market wants. It helps if you also don't care what the market wants. And once you're in that position, then what the market does or doesn't do with your work. And I have been lucky, so I'm very grateful for all the times that I've been lucky and people have liked the work. But I've also fundamentally not cared if something hasn't brought me huge amounts of money. I like Sami's answer more than anything I would have come up with, which is that the sheer value of telling a story that needs to be told, because you can in a time where it's needed, is a very valuable reason to do this. I think over the last couple of decades I've tried out a number of media and a number of industries, and I find I always keep coming back to books, which is the most inconvenient of all these spaces, simply because there is always the least money. We seem to be in a world where people keep predicting the death of the book, and it kind of sputters on regardless. But there are far fewer meetings than in any other field, and that's a huge motivation for me to work in that field, because we live in such a strange world now, and everything is so conformist and everything is so overrun with committees and corporates and guidelines, and the whole idea of, and this is something I've never regretted. I dropped out of management school to become a writer, and that's one thing. I regret most things I've done in my life, but that's one thing that I have never regretted. But the idea was that a life in the arts or in would involve freedom. It would involve, very interesting people, and it has often, but you have to really work to protect that, because it's related to something you were asking earlier, Kev, which is that given the slightest opportunity, you will be put into a box, you will be corporatized, you will be your decisions will be made by committee, your payments will be structured only if you listen to everything that a lot of people on a group email say to you, and you know kind of staying free from that is a struggle. What I always tell people who kind of want to be writers and are asking me how to go about it, first of all, I say, please don't. It's and obviously, if they're going to be writers, they're not going to listen to me saying don't. And if they listen to me saying don't, and that stops them from writing, then they were never going to be writers. But what you have to be careful about is, just remembering that there's just tons of bad advice in the world. And there is no right way to engage with the arts or with life. There is no right process or better process or right thought or wrong thought. And you just spend year after year finding out the way that you do things, finding out what you like, what you are. And obviously this doesn't mean omphaloskepsis to a tremendous degree. Obviously you're also continuously concerned with understanding other people, with empathy with other people, with all of that. But yeah, if you must live a life in any of these fields, you have to be very careful about retaining some kind of core, from when you started and why you started doing it, and all of that.
When you're talking about the endless meetings, I am reminded of one of your blog posts, I think, where you were talking about an experience you had with some film studio people or someone. They were saying, can you do this change? Can you do this change? So can you narrate that specific?
I absolutely do not want to.
Okay.
But first of all, why are you reading my blog? Please don't.
Okay.
No, but yeah, but look. So I mean, when it comes to films, I completely understand why people micromanage everything, because it's a lot of people who have no idea how storytelling works, right? But they have their spreadsheets of how something else did something, and they're extremely risk averse, and they're dealing with crores of money which they don't want to lose, because then they will lose their jobs, and all they want to do is keep their jobs. This is really the only thing they want to do in their lives. So they want to keep their jobs while showing participation, right? So it's lovely when you're in a 15-person group mail, and the table tennis on that goes for months, and eventually you're in a room with 5 people who are somebody's nephew, and they've hired you for a specific reason, and they want to now tell you what to do. So it's kind of this amusing and glamorous but very Kafkaesque process, which I've been lucky enough to be able to use to kind of subsidize the book writing career, because but something where I actually never want to go back.
So there's also something else that I wanted to discuss, and specifically relating to science fiction in India, because as we have been discussing, India specifically represents so many opportunities for budding writers, because there is such a lot of cultural diversity. And I'm thinking specifically in terms of cities and places. Like Samit, your book has Delhi as a focus, and I remember it starts with a couplet, I think, about Delhi. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about how different cities can represent different, cultures, different lifestyles, ways of seeing the world. So can we talk a little bit about that? Like major Indian cities, how they can now provide inspiration to maybe budding sci-fi writers.
Sami, do you wanna go on this, or
Whatever you say, boss.
you talk?
Okay.
I mean, you wrote the Delhi SF novel before I did, so I feel like you should also speak on this before I do.
Okay, yeah. See, I mean, in my case, it was Delhi because it was a city I was born and grew up in. It was a city I was familiar with. But even more importantly, Delhi was a metaphor for, and it still is, for India, right? It's the capital city. So aliens in Delhi sounded much better than aliens in the global south or aliens in India or something like that, right? So I was just trying to work with a city that the title. So I was essentially writing pulpest of pulp. That is what my goal was, to write pulp, have no character development, have no characters, have an entire story that is propelled by the narrative. And then you can have the experiments that I was talking about. Not a character-driven story, but something which is essentially pulp, flat characters throughout, except one. One can be somewhat of a round character, and that is the one character that goes on dismantling all the conventions of genre that we have come to associate with science fiction and a military thriller. So, I mean, this is a question which is, I think, more concerned with the art of writing or the science of writing or the whatever of writing. Is that when you are creating a narrative, when you are creating a story, where are you setting it? Why are you setting it there? How is it that that particular location, the speciality of the setting, interacts with your narrative, your voice, and where do you think that story would have the maximum impact, right, in its narrative, not as an external object, right? Okay, how is Aliens in Delhi going to perform in Delhi? No, of course not. But how is Delhi going to perform in Aliens in Delhi? And how and what does Delhi actually mean for different people? Right. So this is something which I think you have to choose the city in which you set your narrative based on what you want to do with the story. And every city, I mean, for example, I think Vandana Singh, when Fates Conspire, short story set in Calcutta, Anil Menon, Shit Flower, set in Mumbai. There are a couple of stories set in, stories set in Bangalore. So Lavanya's, entire collection set in Bangalore, somewhere near Bangalore. Then SB Divya also has a story set in Bangalore. So, I mean, people can set their story wherever they want to, and I don't think there is one reason that can explicate why that setting is chosen. It may be a whim, it may be a carefully thought out process, it may be something to do with something else, right? So I don't think there is one reason, though of course, if you are familiar with the city that you're writing about, you can write about it in a slightly more efficient way. That is what I feel. But for example, you can't write about New York and say, okay, the desert in New York was very hot until you're writing a dystopia set in 2045. In that case, it works. But
Or in the multiverse.
yeah, exactly. Right. So, I mean, there are so many possibilities here, and that's the point. And that is why a lot of, discussions about SF become so confusing, is because there are so many possibilities that you don't know where to go and what to do. And and then ultimately you just come down to individual enterprise of what you want to do, how you want to interpret it, how you want to read it, how you want to write it. As simple as that.
Yeah, that's a very good
On this
answer.
note, yeah.
No,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
on, Samit.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just saying, if you have any further advice for our budding writers who might be attending this session, so please, both of you, go ahead.
Oh, secure your finances.
Samit, he's the writer.
No, nonsense. Secure your
true,
finances,
that's true.
or no. But I think that like look at. I mean, I'm now in Delhi, and Sami, where are you now?
Oslo.
You're in Oslo. So
Yeah.
obviously, I mean, it's very clear who has managed his life better between the two of us. So, but no, but in all seriousness, if you're looking for advice for budding writers, apart from don't do it, it's that you'll have to find ways to keep your writing yours, right? This will involve making sure that the pragmatic part of your life, the finances, all of that is secured to cover your writing before you. Because I made a mistake when I was lucky in that I managed to kind of do a stage dive and kind of write a book and things worked out, but I was lucky. You in the world of publishing and about authors in general, you only hear about the lottery winners. You only hear about the people who make huge amounts of money, or some big movie got made, or they won some prize or something.
Survivorship bias.
Absolutely. And it's a very harsh industry, right? So one is just secure your basis, because it is a very privilege determined industry and a very luck determined industry, and those two things are very interlinked. So don't depend on it until it is safe for you to depend on it. The other thing is, don't really listen to anyone, including me, because there'll be 18,000 people giving you advice. Most of it is bad. No one knows how any of this works. No one knows how anything will work. So do whatever you want. Yeah.
And see, whether you write a story or not, please tell yourself that in the multiverse you are already a writer, and in some other universe you have already written a book. So just chill and relax and do what you feel like.
Play Candy Crush or whatever the game is now.
Okay, so we'll open the floor to questions. You can look at the question that we already have in the comments. By Professor Asha Munira. She's saying, I am yet to read Red Jihad. I must. With a spoiler alert, could you please say if it does or does not reinforce a pattern which the Empire may like to scare the world with? That is the monster that comes out of a nexus between left and Islam. A very heavy question, but we have time for it. So please do go ahead.
Yes, I mean, this is a great question, but the answer is very simple, just two words, and the answer is spoiler alert. So, well, I'm not sure I can talk any more about this, but yes, as I said, I was taking already established conventions and paradigms and, sort of just playing with them. And if you play with already established paradigms, and the end results may not be what you expect or what is generally regarded to be true, or what is a part of the popular imagination in the public domain. So as I said, there cannot be a spoiler-free answer to this. So my apologies. I would not be able to answer this question, and I would request you to read the book.
Yes, please read the book. I want to apologize in advance. I will have to head soon, I'm afraid. So if there's one question I could take before I go, then
Okay.
I'd like to.
Yeah, Afan was raising a hand. Yeah, Afan, go ahead. You can turn your video on as well if you like.
Okay. my question, I had three questions written down, but I'm going to skip to the most important question to me right now. And this question is related to Mr. Samit Basu, and
Hi.
the question is, playing with situations within a familiar territory is something I've come to enjoy as a creative person. Both your works, Aliens in Delhi, this is about Sami Ahmad Khan's work, and The City Inside are good examples of this. But when I write stories set in my particular city, that is Aligarh, I am faced by obstacles on two fronts. The first obstacle is the people of Aligarh feel caricatured and attacked by my tales, and the people outside my city don't have a clue what I'm talking about. So I'm forced to conclude that the only way to write safe or to write relatable is to write about unreal or extraordinary situations. So how do you make these decisions when writing about some place you're already familiar with, or in some place you come from, most importantly?
Yeah. No, first of all, Ava, that's a lovely question, right? It's a question that has plagued writers not only inside India, but just in anywhere in India when they're looking at the rest of the publishing world. And the thing is that, you're either, and I relate entirely to this, right? I'm from Kolkata, which is a city that in the national eye stopped being interesting sometime in the 80s or so. Um, India stopped being an interesting country apart from very dire reasons sometime in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So constantly especially when you're engaged with finding a wider readership, or when you're, finding that platform which makes your works interesting to whatever nebulous sense you have of a mass audience, then your question is basically, how much do I have to pretend to be from somewhere else or somewhere else for people to listen to my stupid story? Right? Like, why cannot people take me for who I am? This is a universal problem, and this problem exists at some level, regardless of, who of where you are, unless you're some, I don't know, cisgeneration rich white Christian man in Manhattan. Right? There is always a version of this problem everywhere in the world, and the answer to that, really, and it's not a complete answer, of course, is that, see, there will always be two kinds of pressure. One kind of pressure will try to force you into writing the kind of narrative that will be commercially or socially acceptable or successful, right? Which will mean that you will end up writing a cardboard copy of every other hit that has ever been written. That's not something that you want to do. The other pressure will be to kind of change the truth as you perceive it about your own background to fit into some kind of other narrative about other people's misconceptions or mildly incorrect perceptions of how people like you are. You don't want to do either of these. So the only thing I would suggest is that you know it takes us a lot of time, especially when we're students. I grew up under the complete misapprehension that I was not interesting, where I came from was not interesting, my background was not interesting. Interesting people were elsewhere. Interesting people were the people I saw in movies or read about in books, and they were not me, right? So I did not relate to either the stories that were from the past that were supposed to represent me, or the stories from anywhere. Yeah, yes, Kolkata is still interesting, but it took me a long time to understand that, because I thought that my part of the world has been left behind, that it was not interesting. That because my family was not rich or famous or whatever, that they were not interesting. Because it takes a long time for people to understand that everywhere is interesting, every person is interesting, every story, every family, every place is fascinating, right? So the problem is that creating good art takes time, and finding the right audience for that good art also takes time, right? But if this is something that you believe strongly in, if this is something that you really care about, I promise you will find the audience telling exactly the kind of story you want to tell. They are just not near you right now, right? It will take patience. Balancing creativity with career takes infinite amounts of patience, because you basically have to make yourself available for luck to find, right? And you have to keep producing in that hope. Sorry, I'm rambling. I'll yeah, sorry.
So you have answered one part of my question. I agree with you completely that we have to accept ourselves, and we have to come to terms with our own identity before we set out to writing about it on the page.
Not before. It's a process.
It's an
Right.
ongoing process, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, yeah. But please
what-
write about things you don't understand. Don't write what you know. Like
Yes.
write what you know. Write whatever you feel like. Like it is not. Don't set. Don't let other people set limits on what you write.
But what about, okay, I understand that we can be interesting wherever we come from. But what about the people who live amongst, like the people we live amongst? For example, like I mentioned in the first part of my question, the first obstacle that I mentioned was that
Yeah.
people feel caricatured or attacked.
That's their problem.
That's their problem, right? We can ignore
Find-
them, or do we have to migrate to elsewhere before we start
Don't
writing
find him.
about?
Just find other readers. Yeah. Like, I mean, they don't have to. I mean, they probably don't read much else. They don't have to read you.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's literally, I mean, many billion people in the world. It doesn't have to be like that one guy. You don't need anybody's approval.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
These 5 people
Thank you
don't
so
like
much.
something, you don't find 5 other people.
Thank you so much for your words of encouragement, sir.
Thank you very much. Listen,
believe
I
somebody-
have to run, I'm afraid. But thank you so much for having me. I just loved being here. I loved chatting with all of you. Thank you, Kaif. Thank you, Sami, and thank you,
Thank
Ahmad,
you.
for that
Thank
question.
you
That
so
was really
much. It
lovely.
was great interacting with you, and we hope to see you again
Lovely.
hopefully sometime in the
Lovely.
future.
Thanks all. I have
Okay.
to. Apologize for
No
having to rush,
problem.
but I have to rush.
No
Yeah,
problem.
bye.
No problem. Dr. Khan, you will have to take the remaining questions by yourself, I'm afraid. So,
Sure. First of all, please stop calling me Dr. Khan. I'm not Dr. Khan. Call me Sami. Dr. Khan
okay,
is so
okay,
formal and so weird. Yeah.
okay. Neha was raising a hand. Neha, please go ahead.
Okay. Firstly, thank you so much for that insightful, interesting talk. So my question might be slightly long since I might not be able to put my point in a few words. So I wanted to talk about this problem which science fiction is facing, which is the problem of the future. So when we were reading science fiction during, during the 18th century, during the 19th century, so it was always about stories of an exciting futures like aliens, space, travel, and telepathy and whatnot. And now when the future has arrived, it's not that great. We are seeing, there's lots. We still have in dystopianism. We have, it's very depressing. I mean, wars, bad politics, and all that. So when the future looked bright, so dystopianism was a pleasant counterpoint to the boosterism of future. So when real life looks very grim and future looks more grim, and people are less interested in futurism in science fiction, I believe. So the spectacle, I also feel like fantasy film and science fiction still can be a little compelling, but books are different because they require thinking. So and people are actually, escapism has lost its shine, I feel, and people don't actually want to think about the future. So how, if somebody wants to write science fiction, how do they deal with this problem of when people are not actually interested in thinking about the future since it looks grim?
Well, thank you for that question, Neha. I think William Gibson wrote almost 2 decades ago that the future is already here. It's not evenly distributed. But then you have to ask yourself, whose future are you talking about? And what is this, distribution that you're referring to? This is the question that you raised. I mean, this is a very valid question. How do you write a dystopia while living in a dystopia? And well, on the other hand, if you start to write a utopia while living in a dystopia, people would say you're an escapist. If you are writing a dystopia while in a dystopia, people would say, well, you're writing realism. This is not exactly science fiction because what you're writing about is actually happening. You're talking about food shortages, extreme food shortages, well, happening right now. You're talking about this really, big brotherly state somewhere on a different planet. Well, it's happening right now. You talk about, extreme form of otherization happening on planet XYZ. Well, you know what? It's happening here. So, science fiction is fun because it gives you ways to play with this. It will not lead you to answers. It will just lead you to better ways of reformulating the questions that haunt you, the questions that keep you awake at night, the questions that refuse to go away. And SF is something, science fiction is something which for me works in that case. I don't really have a suggestion or a direct response to you. primarily because we're all different human beings who think differently, want different things, and are driven by different, like motives. You ask yourself, placed as you are in your particular milieu, what would you want to do in order for things to get better? There may be, things getting better in your colony. There may be things getting better on this planet. There may be things getting better in this entire universe or the multiverse or whatever. This is where, your own positionality comes in. And rather than just, so you can always keep on thinking about it. I would suggest, as a very therapeutic and cathartic exercise, start writing something in any format. In any format that speaks to you, in any genre that speaks to you, in any language that speaks to you. It's not as if कि English में ही लिखना है. जब भी आपकी mother tongue है, आप उसमें लिखें. उसमें whatever you feel like doing, you do it. And just see how that writing somehow helps you to answer the questions that really speak to you in ways more than one. Right? And I'm intentionally giving you a very generic response so that others can also sort of, fill in their blanks. This is there's no one answer that is going to solve the crisis immediately. The crisis is already here. When we talk about narratives that are so, vary of the crisis, it's going to happen in the next 50 years, 100 years, GHG emissions and food shortages, water scarcity, global climate change, but it's happening right here, right now. It's happening as we speak. So how does that change your narrative, your story, your characters, where you set them, how they talk to each other? That is something that depends entirely on you, and you just pick your own way. Pick something that works for you. And the only way to know if it works for you is by picking it up in the first place. If it doesn't, work, do something else. And with this, I would like to sort of, shift to earlier question that I think Afan raised, that in my opinion, people will always be pissed off at it. If you write, people will always be pissed off at you, And for example, when I wrote Red Jihad, as I said, almost a decade ago, 2010, yeah, I think Red Jihad was written in 2010. And I got hate mail from left, right, and center. And by left, right, and center, I mean left, right, and center. Because they were all unhappy. They're like, no, you're not portraying us in a good light. Come on, I'm not here to do, your propaganda of left, right, or center. I'm just here to, say something, that I feel like saying. So people will always be angry at, why did you write this? How could you write this? Let them be. You just do what you want to do. The market will also tell you things you can do and the things you cannot do. All the publishers, they kept telling me, why the hell you are in JNU? So write a romance novel because now it's selling so much. I'm talking about 2010, 11, 12, right? They're like, write a romance novel. I'm like, I don't want to write a romance novel. I want to write a military thriller, And they're like, no, but, think about it. This is going to sell more. And I'm not writing to sell. I'm just writing because I love to write this, right? So this is something that, that I would also suggest to you, that just take with whatever works for you. And just run with it. Don't think about people will say this, market will say this, the critics will say this, because nobody, trust me, nobody will be happy with you. Nobody. And your job is not to make people happy. Your job is to make yourself happy first. And to make yourself happy, you write what you feel like writing. So don't worry about, this or that, these things. If you start worrying, then you will not be able to write at all. Because trust me, show me one line that would not piss at least 1% of this human population off. Kuch bhi, you find anything, I will tell you, no, this is bad for, they will hate it, they will hate it, they will hate it. So, I mean, come on. We will never be able to articulate anything if that is the way. Yes, back to you, Kaif.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat box, so you can look at that one. How can we come up with a system of evaluating the science in sci-fi stories? There's the Hyperion and Hitchhiker's Guide. Should we avoid reading them? Are there any archetypes to demonstrate the characteristics of a sci-fi work?
My God, I think my heart just stopped beating for like 5 seconds straight. Dude, Hitchhikers is like the best thing ever written. How can you even ask this question and say, should we avoid reading Hitchhikers? The purpose of human existence is to read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy multiple times, right?
Science
So,
fiction is not science that we can objectively,
but come on, that's 42, exactly. But come on, that's the point. This is, okay, again, this is something I talk about at length in the monograph too, about what is science and who's science. What is science today? Wasn't science 100 years ago? What was alchemy 100 years ago might be something else today. So this past, present, and future, science, quasi-science, pseudo-science, proto-science, all these things, our interpretation of science, our definition of science keeps on changing. So when you say how to evaluate science, which science are you talking about? What kind of science are you talking about? Are you saying, okay, well, I'm talking about Western post-enlightenment idea of science and rationality? If you categorize it like that, then I would say, well, there are other kinds of science available. There is the entire idea of indigenous scientific literacies or traditional ecological knowledges. By the way, some of them can be used for different purposes. As the meme says, "Meri shaktiyon ka galat istemal hua hai." So some of these things could be used for very different purposes, because you're going to say, okay, because then you actively promoting fascism by saying that, okay, well, we had science for like 5,000 years and we had nuclear weapons and the West knows nothing and we are the actual originators of science. And interestingly, this is something used by almost all the religions across the world. That, okay, well, religion comes from science comes from our religion. Your religion doesn't know what science is. It comes from our religion. And this is I mean, why this is just one more way of dividing people. So I would say that if you actually come up, if you really want to come up with a system of evaluating the science, then you may ask yourself, what kind of science are you talking about? What is the arcade of that science? Where is that science coming from? What is the geographical location, the cultural location of that science? What is the ideology with which that science is interlinked as students of literature? So one way is that, so in the Indian classical tradition, the idea of Gyan and Vigyan. So Vigyan is fine, Vigyan is cool, right? Vigyan is science, but Gyan is even better than Vigyan. Gyan is knowledge, right? So again, so every tradition comes with its own way of approaching this dialectic between science and quasi-science and proto-science. So I mean, you can do it, of course. It can be a good research paper, but this cannot be the purpose of your existence. Right? This is a great research paper. This is a wonderful research paper in which you are discussing science. This is a great book, right? But then you have to ask yourself, what is your vantage point and what kind of political, historical, ideological, social, cultural, and aesthetic ideas of science are you talking about and why? Right. So please don't avoid reading anything. I would say read whatever you want, read whatever works for you. So never ever, think that, okay, should we do this? Should we not do this? Remove the word should. You do what you feel like doing. As simple as that. You are students of literature. I assume most of you are students of literature, right? I assume that. Most of you, right? So in literature specifically, there is it's not as if you have to do something or you don't have to do something. You have the freedom, you feel like doing whatever you want to do. And then archetypes to demonstrate the characteristics. Again, a lot of models have been advanced. I talk about the transmit thesis in my book, which is about how Indian SF almost always has mythology, it has technology, and it has ideology.